I'm Carol Snow, Deputy Chief Conservator and the Alan J. Dworsky Senior Conservator of Objects at the Art Gallery. As a former very low-level apprentice in Master Pamela Smith's amazing atelier, where they study natural and unnatural worlds, this fantastic flying rat being one small example of their achievements, I'm thrilled to introduce her to you all today. Pamela Smith received her undergraduate degree in the History and Philosophy of Science from the University of Wollongong in New South Wales, Australia, and her doctorate in the History of Science from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Prior to becoming the Seth Lowe Professor of History at Columbia University in 2005, Pamela worked on a variety of related positions at the Claremont Colleges in California. She has taught and published extensively on the intersections of early modern European history and the history of science. We congratulate Pamela for receiving the 2018 Columbia University Faculty Mentoring Award that recognizes excellence in mentoring PhD students in their graduate careers. Since 2014, Pamela has been the founding director of the Making and Knowing Project at Columbia, a pedagogical and research initiative that explores the intersections of craft making and scientific knowing. She has received numerous grants to support its activities to explore the role of craft skill in scientific practice. Her talk today is entitled Learning Through Reconstruction, the Making and Knowing Project. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Pamela Smith.
Thank you so much, Carol, and it's really a privilege to be here. I look forward to your questions. I'm going to kind of speed through all my many images so that we can get to some of your questions. But before I start, I wanted to thank Carol and Ian for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a real privilege to be here. I wish I was a student here, actually, in this wonderful workshop. So I'm just going to start right in. The 16th and 17th centuries saw a great increase in writings on technical subjects, and this increase included a publication of collections of recipes, as well as the formation of an audience for these so-called how-to books. They included things like mining, distillation, and this example, Hieronymus Brunschwig's Distillierbuch, is an example of the way in which such texts, which wrote down experiential knowledge that had not previously been written down, in the European tradition at least, were produced by the practitioners themselves rather than by scholars, such as Vannoccio Biringuccio, mine manager and metalworker, and this Master Albrecht, the little book of how to physic horses. But the books ranged widely among many different subjects, including things like model books for embroidery. And these model books for embroidery, as you can see from this wonderful title page, was the work of an entrepreneurial printer. And many of these how-to texts were the work of these entrepreneurial printers, a group really between scholars and artisans. By the mid-16th century, a huge number of such books were being printed in many different languages, vernacular and Latin alike. They seem to have sold well for the printers, and each of these translations of this pseudonymous Book of Secrets by the pseudonymous Alessio Piemontese included different content, so you can see how they're also compilations. Although this particular text possessed a core set of topics that included casting, metal casting, perfumery, and some medical recipes. Experiential knowledge was taken up as a vehicle of intellectual, university, religious, and social reform by writers such as Theophrastus von Hohenheim, called Paracelsus. And you can see from his challenging statement here, who could be taught the knowledge of experience from paper? Paper has the property to produce lazy and sleepy people. Therefore, the most fundamental thing is to hasten to experience. Intellectual reformers, such as Georgius Agricola, whose De Re Metallica, 12 books of metals, was a humanist. And his work involved reconciling his own world with that of antiquity. And his own world was, in fact, as a shareholder in mining, and he wanted to make it as valorized. He wanted to make mining knowledge and his investment in it as valorized as the De Re Rustica of the Roman author Columella. And his first book on mining was actually it just shows the kind of humanistic activity. It was actually a word list of miners' jargon with matching Latin terms that he made up. Curiously, at the same time more and more technical writings appeared, the artisans writing them claimed repeatedly that their writings could not convey their knowledge fully. They insisted on the difficulty of writing down experience in writing. And here the assayer is talking about the years and experience that is needed for his craft, rather than the methods of university learning, speculation and dispute. Now, it's difficult to write down experience because descriptions become very, very complicated, as all of you know who have tried to describe some experiential process. Moreover, in a workshop, the material conditions change, and one must account for all of those changed conditions if you're going to be thorough. And this is indicated by Leonardo's comment here, that the more minutely you describe it, the more you will confound the mind of the reader. So he's making a plea here for depicting rather than describing in words. One example of practical knowledge getting lost over time because all the steps are difficult to put into words is casting from life, such as in this wonderful work, including this little 3/4-inch fly of the master goldsmith of Nuremberg, Wenzel Jamnitzer. And this brings me to the Making and Knowing project, because I first became interested in this very interesting manuscript, Manuscript Français 640, that's now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And it contains, as you can see here, the most detailed descriptions of life casting of any extant written source. And this is a picture of how to arrange a lizard, as you can see, for casting on the clay base. And here's an example of a 16th century life cast. I'll turn now to this 170 folio manuscript. It contains, it was written down in the late 16th century, and it contains all kinds of notes, instructions, and observations on many, many different procedures, the bulk of which are for casting. There are almost 1,000 entries in the manuscript, and about 600 of them are for casting. But there are many, many other types of instructions, such as here for imitation coral. These are objects, most of them are objects, which would fit into a Kunstkammer, a collection of the time. And in fact, this manuscript was collected by a noble, Philippe de Béthune, an important noble in the French court, who also purchased Caravaggios. A couple of his Caravaggios, marked with the same coat of arms that you saw on the cover of the book, surfaced in France about 20 years ago. So he was obviously interested in art. Perhaps he commissioned this manuscript from a metalworker. Perhaps he bought the manuscript from an ambitious artist. We simply don't know. I'm going to turn now to the research that the Making and Knowing team has carried out since 2014 on this manuscript. Now, the Making and Knowing project has several aims. The central one now is the creation of a digital critical edition of this remarkable manuscript. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, and also focus on some of the pedagogical aims and ways in which we do things in this lecture. Our research is carried out under 4 main research components. The first one was a paleography workshop. There have been 3 sections of paleography workshop over the summer, and they in which we produce the transcription and the translation at the same time, teaching the students Middle French paleographic skills. And our lead paleographer, Mark Smith, is at the École de France. So they learn not only paleography, but also in the beginning they learned to use Google Drive, which at one point was new. So we work in Google Drive, which is not ideal, but allows for simultaneous editing. And we had, as I said, 3 paleography workshops. And then since then, we've had 2 text workshops, which means that we are refining the translation and doing all the markup that will allow textual analysis. The second component are the laboratory seminars, and these are regularly scheduled semester-long seminars in a laboratory, an old chemistry laboratory at Columbia, in which MA and PhD students and a few undergraduates do research on the entries of the manuscript. So they need to keep laboratory, what we call laboratory field notes, on, and it has been up until now, on a wiki, in which they keep very detailed accounts of their procedures as they're doing the experiments. They also keep all of their photographs on an open Flickr account. Again, a commercial platform, but it's the kind of best we've been able to find. And what they do in the laboratory course is the end product are what we call the annotations, the critical commentary on the manuscript's entries. And we've always chosen a theme. In the first year, it was mold making and metalworking, so that we can kind of consolidate the skill building and consolidate the activities in the lab. And you can see the kinds of annotations or essays that they wrote. And what they really are, these concentrated research essays. It's extremely intensive work with them, but it's very valuable because at the end of it, they're getting a published or soon to be published essay. So you can see some of the entries in the manuscript: imitation coral, founders of small tin work, about making pilgrim medals, knowledge exchange, sands and binders. So some of them look at a particular recipe, as we call them, or entry in the manuscript. Some of them are about some of the themes. This was the second year, color making. Again, you can see some of the themes, some of the topics. This was the third year, practical knowledge, or what we called vernacular natural history, practical perspective, optics, and medicine, which was a fascinating year that I'll talk about in a minute. And then last year we had a reduced number so we could really work on the digital critical edition, and we did ephemeral art, the kind of festival art that unusually this manuscript contains recipes for producing. So the students come into the class usually without any skills, hand skills. It's really rare when they have them. And even sometimes they come in with never having baked bread, not being at all skilled in cooking, which helps a lot. And so we do skill building, which we've built up over the years. And I'm just going to show you a couple of them. This is, we start off actually with a historical culinary recipe, Reconstruction, in which they take home a very obscure recipe and then they cook it at home, and they have to think about all of the compromises that they have to make during the reconstruction of it. First they have to figure out what it's for. So it's very useful, and they have to puzzle it out in groups together. It's actually a great exercise if you're doing a material culture class, and because anybody can do it in any kitchen, and it really helps them think about what was historically different in the past and how do we reconstruct that today. Then we move on usually to this fascinating intermediary process in the manuscript, bread molding, which seems to have been for a method of trying out a small sculpture or a medallion to press it into newly baked bread and then take it out and then pour it, with impressing a model into the newly baked bread, taking it out, and then pouring wax, tallow, or sulfur in it to test out the detail. And, this is an example of an intermediary process, which there's no record of it today. Obviously, there's no old bread molds around. But this is one thing that the manuscript gives us access to, but it's also a great skill building exercise because we give them sourdough starter and say, okay, go figure out how to make bread, and then come in 2 weeks later with your bread molds. And this, you can see some of the detail that is possible. It looks kind of distorted from here, but you can see in this one, the mask, that was the model. Oh, there you can see how well the detail comes out. Another thing that we do is cuttlefish bone casting, a very ancient technique which is still used today, and there are 4 methods of it in the manuscript for pressing together the bones. We do verdigris growing and painting out. We do color red lake making to show them the difference between dyes and pigments. We have reconstructed techniques of still life flower painting to give them an idea about layering up of color. We've experimented using the recipes in the manuscript with distemper paints. And then the third component of the manuscript, of the whole project, are the working group meetings at the end. And what this does is bring together scholars who are expert in that particular subject theme that we've worked on for the year. Carol's come to a couple of them. And what happens at them is that the students present on their work, and scholars really provide critical oversight over their essays, their commentary. And this, is necessary because, in contrast to what Carol said, none of us are actually masters of anything in our lab. Some of us have more experience in one of the themes or another, but we're definitely not experts in any of it. And so we do need experts. And in that regard, we also bring in an expert maker for 2 weeks every year or every semester to help with the skill building and to help with the annotations. So we've had working group meetings each of the past 4 years. The fourth component of the manuscript is the transformation of the now thousands and thousands of files in different formats into the digital edition of the manuscript. And we have some early prototypes. We're working with a designer developer. That looks very bled out from there. But you can see some of the ways in which it's going to be side-by-side reading. I won't go into it. If you have questions, you can ask afterwards. So those are the 4 components of the project. And now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what Reconstruction has taught us and what kind of learning it has facilitated. And I'm just going to focus on a few of these. We don't have time to do more. So what we learned in mold making and metalworking, you'll remember some of the essays that were written, is that we were able to decipher both some of the recipes, and that means, for example, we came to a conclusion about what this marginal note, try burnt oysters, meant on the side. And in the process of making some of the binders and some of the sands that are in the manuscript, we also found a lot of evidence of first-hand experience, as you can see here, in the manuscript. We learned the time and labor intensive nature, maybe you're learning some of this in your work this week, of making any of these procedures. And we also realized the repeated trials that the author practitioner, as we call the author of this text, did were about investigating materials in his local surroundings, which turns out to have been around Toulouse. Here we are deciphering more the recipes using a different kind of binder. We are deciphering materials, this interesting Spat, which seems to be a German word that he's using, a German term for the sand that's located, or the earth that's located outside of Augsburg. We learned about deciphering in the first year materials of all kinds, including what he calls magistra, or the binder for sand casting. Technical terms such as impalpable, impalpable sand, turns out to be a technical term. And we learned the meaning of fatty sand. So this really showed us that there was a system of categories that formed the knowledge system of the author practitioner. The opposition between fat and lean, really has to be added, at least for metal workers, to the contraries of Aristotelian natural philosophy, like hot, cold, wet, dry. Fat and lean is very common, it turns out, in metal casting and metals writings. We learned a lot about specific techniques such as life casting, and a very interesting, there's a lot of metal casting, portrait metal casting in the manuscript. I won't go into this fascinating, clever technique now because I don't have time. But we also learned about the challenges of reconstructions, which we actually already knew about very well. And you can see that in this iterative process that is always part of this project, the students learned how to use sands and binders very imperfectly, however. But the good thing is that we can do it again the following year, or our collaborators, for example, here at the University of Amsterdam, the metals conservation program actually reconstructed this also. And so they had great success, as you can see, with what's called InQ's reverse casting. This is the model, and these are the results. This is the model, and these are the results, obviously, with the casting infrastructure still attached. We learned about the importance of qualitative rather than quantitative statements in the manuscript. For example, comparing the consistency of things to mustard, and in fact he even includes a mustard recipe in the manuscript, so we tried that out as well. And this is what the lab came to refer to as the squeeze test. The sand should give a nice hold and still come apart easily. So what he's describing there is this ideal consistency of sand for casting, for sand casting. Sand meaning earth, really. Sable is what he calls it. And this is important because, of course, there are hardly any quantitative measurements in the manuscript. And so, that shows, in fact, the use of qualitative tests like this shows really just how work with non-standard materials happens, right? It's a matter of investigation. It's a matter of finding the right consistency. It's not a matter of measuring precisely, because in fact, if it were a drier day or a more humid day, you might need a different amount of a sand. Similarly, to know before thermometers, obviously, to know the heat of this alloy, it's measured by a paper test. And this is reconstructed 17th century paper from the Iowa Paper Project. We learned about the preoccupations of the author practitioner, his material imaginary, and his interest in transforming materials into different states, such as mixing sulfur and wax to make a substance that's in fact a better molding material. We learned about his constant investigation of materials, in which he hypothesized about what materials and what processes would work best for his metal casting and life casting. And in the process, what he did really, and I think this is common to any workshop, is to form taxonomies of materials and their characteristics. Here he's doing the same for yellow pigments, a great interest in the 16th century because there weren't any fast yellows. We also realized that the author practitioner is using some substances such as sulfur, which is it's all over the manuscript. I mean, not physically, but in words. In fact, the manuscript is very clean, in case you're asking, very clean copy, which means that he was going into another room and writing these things down, which is interesting in itself. So sulfur is all over the manuscript. It's a very versatile material. It's not very expensive at this point. It would be typical in a metal casting, in a metalworking studio. And we think that he's using it as a material metaphor to signal, to mean, but more really to enact the concept of exploring by experimenting, because he's using it in all kinds of ways to experiment. So those were some of the things we learned in the mold making year. We learned color making. You'll remember some of the topics that the students took up. The manuscript contains many sleight of hand tricks, very interestingly, but in many ways it's the inverse side of the power of art. The deceptive practices that imitate substances or deceive by creating a representation of something else, and a convincing representation of something else. So some of them are in fact about deceiving by creating white wine out of red wine. Well, it's not really red wine. It's water colored with Brazil wood, but it changes when you drop in lemon juice. So it's a nice little trick. Some of them are about real sleight of hand tricks. Most of the color-making processes in the manuscript are, in fact, about imitation, creating effects through imitating another material. So this imitation of gold without gold on silver, is not about deception, but rather is a very common technique used by furniture makers. And he's not deceiving here so much as imitating if you look, whoops, let's try that again. This is the real gold here, right over here, that's the gold leaf, and then these were 3 of the experiments. If you watch this one, which is a gold pigmented varnish, a yellow pigmented varnish on silver leaf, you can see that what he's imitating are the reflective properties of gold. The manuscript contains imitations of costly materials in cheaper media, such as here, Rouge Clair imitation in oil and resin. Here, damasked cloth, not very successful. Here, coral contrefait, imitation marble, and many recipes for imitating precious stones. And they were quite successful. This is a real emerald ring that one of the students had. And then here are their imitations. Several recipes all of these recipes rather, are aimed at producing visual effects, the same as this one. And we came to call that, which is about how to layer up and create the perfect flesh tone, we called that practical optics. We also did reconstructed the imitation jasper, and this is real jasper, that's the imitation jasper. We actually reconstructed that over 3 years, and each time we came to understand the manuscript much better. So the Palissy, Bernard Palissy, the 16th century French potter, claimed to investigate natural processes in his making of ceramics, what he called the art of the earth, and thereby to learn about the real processes of nature. And, we can look at these kinds of making processes as that kind of investigation into the processes of nature. I don't think our author practitioner was consciously doing that, but I think that it's within a set of activities which is, interesting to people. So imitation is interesting because it has that investigative power. And that's what we really came to see in the color making year, was how fully craft practice was an interaction and constant experimentation with natural materials. So it was both investigative and philosophizing in terms of its ability to set out and to investigate the processes of nature. So finally, vernacular natural history, medicine, practical optics, perspective, and mechanics, the year before last. You can see some of the activities in that year: silkworms, reconstructing cures, etc. So this was one of the most fascinating material reconstructions. And again, it's an easy reconstruction to do. It's for a burn salve, which the author practitioner says that he got from a gunpowder maker whose whole face had been entirely scarred, but he saw not a trace of it. And what this is an unusual recipe within the manuscript, partly because it's a medical recipe. There are only about 40 medical recipes in the manuscript out of over 1,000. But also because it includes a clear religious dimension. And what happens in it is that you mix together linseed oil and beeswax. You let the wax curdle, as he says, so it's cooling and congealing. And then you begin mixing it with holy water. I admit we did not use holy water, although you can buy holy water from Lourdes on Amazon. But we mixed it, and as you mix it, you time it by saying the Pater Noster. Now, this is not unusual to time processes in a workshop by saying the Pater Noster. But the unusual thing in this recipe is that you do it in an order. You do 9 times, then you dump out the water and add more holy water, then you do it 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 times. And at the end of it, your mixture has expanded about 5 times. You can see that it's completely filled up that little pot that we had it in. It's turned into, as you know, an emulsion. It's a very basic, the same thing mayonnaise is, a very basic kind of material and process. But it really shows the way that the part of the meaning of this process and the burn salve is the fact that it is an inspirited material by the time you finish with the 45 paternosters and the holy water. So if we had never reconstructed this recipe and had just read it in the manuscript, we never would have appreciated this material dimension of the spiritual practice. So I think that's a really good example of the ways in which you can gain a better understanding of a period by doing these kinds of material investigations and reconstructions. We also investigated the medicine of the Orientals against all maladies, as the heading is in the manuscript, and it was smoking rosemary in a pipe. That was the medicine of the Orientals against all maladies, which just showed the way in which practices, as they traveled really around the globe, the pipe coming from not this pipe, but the pipe that the author practitioner actually depicts in the manuscript coming from the New World, but obviously he's thinking of it as an Eastern Oriental thing. So just the way that these practices are traveling around the globe in the late 16th century. And then vernacular natural history. Now, what we meant by vernacular natural history, similar to practical optics, are all the ways of interacting with animals in order to use them in making objects, such as here, catching, keeping, feeding, and killing, and then posing the animals for life casting. And in the process of doing that, the author practitioner has all sorts of observations on these animals. It's absolutely fascinating. So that's a kind of vernacular pursuit of natural history. Similarly, silkworm cultivation, which was very common in France in the 16th century, or very commonly sought in France in the 16th century. But this is an interesting recipe that actually one of the few recipes, or actually the only recipe in the manuscript that has alchemical overtones. So all of the work of making molds in order to cast is part of the author practitioner's preoccupation with imitating and preserving lifelikeness. Again, a kind of vernacular natural history that's also found in the other processes in the manuscript, such as keeping flowers in the same condition all year, which is drying them in sand. It's remarkable how silky they come out. They really come out like silk flowers, not like the kind of dried flowers that you would expect. And they're still in this condition. That middle one is the dried one. The one on the left is the fresh one. They're still in this condition today, I mean, after 2 years. It's also found in the other recipes, such as drying and posing animals. And in the drying animals in an oven, in which he says one can add a painted tongue or horns or wings or anything you may imagine, the same goes for rats or any animal, he's not just imitating nature, but he's also playing on how the human hand can alter and transform nature. Very typical of a Kunstkammer collection. So we can see that even in such quotidian processes of art making, such as pigment making, that you take raw materials, you push them beyond their apparent properties to make something entirely different. It makes them take on or imitate the characteristics and appearances of other substances. Thus, we really found throughout the project that we see how the practice of imitation is a structuring mechanism for all craft practice. And if you think about it, imitation is the key to learning as an apprentice craftsperson, to transmitting knowledge from workshop to workshop, through models, through working in another workshop. And imitation extends to being able to produce, and in this case, to being able to understand natural materials, the characteristics of natural materials. It's, in fact, I would say the key to what I call an artisanal epistemology, the way of gaining knowledge as an artisan and in the workshop. By the 17th century, it became key to new philosophers, people who called themselves new experimental philosophers or the new scientists of the 17th century. It became key to their epistemology. They said you can know something, not within the Aristotelian system of causes, but you can know something by being able to imitate it. So to produce an effective imitation is to know a material. So that's what I hope that you have questions, because that's what I've brought to the table here. And these are just a few of our collaborators. I mean, this is a huge, turns out to be a huge project, and has engaged and been supported by an enormous number of people. So thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.
Thanks. Hello, thanks. It's very interesting and fascinating work, but I'm wondering, how are you going to publish these, your results? Mm-hmm. It's obviously going to be some annotated translation, but is it going to be available online?
Yeah.
Because it seems a marvelous project for some interactive flipping through the original text, getting the translation, your photographs and videos. It's really would be interesting if something like that is in planning.
Yes, it's going to be open access digital. It's a digital project, and you'll be able to read in facing screens, or whatever it's called, pages, the facsimile, well, any combination of the facsimile, the transcription, the French normalized transcription, and the English translation. So you'll be able to choose two of those to be looking at any one time. And then along the border will be little icons which will indicate that there is an annotation on that process. And you'll be able to click into that annotation. That's, let's see, I can go back to that actually. Way at the beginning. Sorry to flip through like this. But that will indicate that there's an annotation there, and it will open up within the text. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. So it will open up like that choral making within the text, and you'll be able to watch the videos, you'll be able to look at the illustrations, and you'll be able to read the essay. And the essay will be structured pretty much like any sort of text scholarly essay. It will have text and images. I mean, it will have many more images, and that's why, we're part of the reason we're doing it digitally, of course, because you could never really represent all of our media in any other format. So there will also be a sandbox, a place where you can take the data and work with it yourselves. That is the manuscript itself. You can take all of the data and work with it yourself. And it will also, it's fully marked up. So it's marked up for things like animals, people, names. There are very few names in the manuscript. Author names, very few author names. That's one of the interesting things about it. It has a list of authors at the beginning, but then there's no relationship of those two to the recipes. Environments, body parts, place names, so a whole range of categories we've decided on to mark up the manuscript. And so you'll be able to do things like frequency comparisons between fat and lean, for example. Are they located where, or where is the location of this term or this kind of material in the whole 170 folios of the manuscript. So there's lots you can do with it. You'll be able to do with it. You'll be able to generate word lists of materials. There will be a glossary. It has now, we had to compile a glossary for translation because collaborative translation is like almost impossible to maintain consistency, which was something we kind of didn't realize at first. Everything has been new to us in some ways. But what we did was compile a glossary and a way of translating certain repeated words or terms and phrases. And our glossary is now something like 65 pages long. So it will have a full glossary, which you'll be able to roll over the term, and the translation or the definition will come up. There will be, commentary, editorial commentary on why we translated something in a certain way. So it's all of this remains to act. I mean, it's basically in our Google Drive version of this, but it all remains to be transformed into the digital edition, which is sort of overwhelming because it's, we have promised all our grant support that we will publish, or at least we'll release the first edition at the end of 2019. So that's coming close. But anyway, that was a very long answer. I know there are other questions.
Thank you for that talk. I'm really curious about the burn cream and that bit of anecdote that we had, that something like his whole face had been burnt, but there was no sign of it.
Mm-hmm. How did he know, right?
Right. Either a small anecdote, like one of your collaborators had a burn and this emulsion happened to be around, or maybe something really formal like partnering with the medical school at Columbia and the burn unit. Has there been any interest in seeing what this can really do and whether it's practical and useful?
You cannot try things out like that in a lab. We underwent very extensive safety protocol. I mean, the chemistry department was most worried about us being in a lab that, there would be safety problems. So we all trained, and, we have to get recertified, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, obviously you can't try out medical recipes in a lab. However, one of the students took some of this and put it on a sunburn, and he said that the sunburn went away immediately, but then came back. So totally unscientific test. And, could we partner with Columbia Medical School? In an ideal world, you could, but frankly, all of those people are so busy that it's very hard to get the attention of any sort of science labs. I mean, the work of a science lab is just constant. I mean, any sort of activity, and that's, something that as a historian of science, I knew, but I didn't know it experientially, which is just how long any sort of experiential and iterative process takes. And so we just haven't, we've reached out, we have relations with some of the science labs at Columbia, but it's really hard. It's just, they're just too busy.
Hey, so I was struck by the squeeze test.
Yeah.
And this point you made that made total sense, that so you might imagine in such a recipe trying to quantify it, say add exactly this amount of moisture, or have some moisture measurement as your or hydration measurement as you're adding water or whatever. But in the end, it's not the right way to think about it, because there's other variability, and what you really want is this final sort of tactile property at the end, right? And so it made me think of scientific measurements more generally, and how often as scientists in the field of cultural heritage, sometimes we bring this experience from other fields that doesn't really map directly. But what you could imagine is that once you've had these tactile experiences, once you've gone through these sort of more hands-on processes, you might be like, okay, well, now that I have a feel for it, now I know the measurement that I want. It's not hydration quantity or whatever. It's this mechanical, tactile property, right? And now you can imagine trying to quantify it in a way. And so you could, in a way, sort of bring maybe back the science at this certain stage. So I was curious if that's, I don't know, something that ever came up in your class, or something that was ever considered incorporating in this kind of a course structure, the idea of bringing in a rigorous quantitative measurement at the end of these experiences.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the real aim of the project is historical, and the historical situation is that materials most often were not standardized, and in fact, our materials that we buy are not standardized. I mean, even suppliers of historical pigments such as Kramer, those are not actually standardized pigments. I mean, they are put forward as such, but they've been analyzed, and they don't actually, in case any of you are using them, they are not what they claim to be always. So we're in kind of the same world in many ways. We have to get our stuff from different suppliers as well. Plus, our stuff is not, I mean, it's neither historically accurate nor is it modern standardized. And our lab is completely unairtight. I mean, it's a mess in many ways. But of course, so I'm not saying that our lab replicates the real atmosphere or environment of a workshop, of an early modern workshop, but my point being that simply materials are non-standard in that period by and large, and workshops are open to the elements, so there's not, it doesn't make that much sense to quantify. Now, having said all that, of course, that is exactly what the experimental philosophers in the 17th century began to try to do. Some of you may already know that the first efforts of the Royal Society of London for the accumulation of natural knowledge, and the Académie Royale des Sciences in Paris, both founded in the mid-17th century, the first actions that they did were to interview craftspeople about their techniques, because craftspeople knew about nature, they knew about natural processes, and so they interviewed them and then they began forming their own laboratories and working in their laboratories, and then because they had always seen mathematics, and especially geometry, as a certain science, they did try to quantify, but they also, most of them acknowledged that quantifying natural materials was pretty much impossible. So I mean, there's a historical point to be gained from trying that kind of thing. But the other thing is that just realistically, working with these sands, if it's humid, or if in the winter, for example, the air in the lab is just unbelievably dry, I mean, you're going to need a different amount of liquid. So it depends what your goal is in a reconstruction, whether you want to try to quantify, whether you want to, or in pedagogy, whether you want to then show students that, what it means to quantify. I mean, for us, it was the other way around. The students kept saying, I don't know how much to add. How much should I add? And then we started looking for what we came to call consistency markers. So that was a really wonderful lesson in many ways. I think there's a question right down here.
Thank you. Forgive me if you clarified this and I missed it, but what is the relationship of this written manuscript to the published ones? Was there, I mean, it's obviously a nicely written one too, so it's not just his jottings.
Absolutely.
So was there something significant to that hand quality?
Yeah, so that's been our, who is this person, right? He has great skill, he seems to have great skill in metalworking, has all of the, materials of metalworking, lead, rock salt, sulfur, he uses them a lot. So, figuring out the identity, most of the manuscript is in this hand, but some of it is clearly dictated because they're like blanks for some of the words, which are then filled in with this hand. So all of that would, and the fact that there was a separate room, which he clearly had to go into to write this down. And also, I mean, there are just a lot of codicological problems, which we just will never have the answer to. One is these headings, right? The headings are carefully laid out, and then, he clearly, in many of them, ran out of room and started writing up in the sides. So they must have been laid out beforehand, right? And so what does that mean about the plans for it? It might have been a draft of something that was to be published, or he imagined publishing, but it's a very, very messy and chaotic draft. I mean, it's clearly the result of going in and redoing things, and but it's true, the pages are very clean. So one of the things that we always have students do is compile in the first couple weeks of their research for their annotation what we call a recipe genealogy. So to try and find recipes that precede or that are similar to this. And what they've found, it's very surprising, is that there are hardly any. We have found no wording that is similar to a published text. There are many, many recipes that are very obviously very common. I mean, many procedures that are very, very common, and we find them all over recipe texts, preceding, contemporaneous, and after this manuscript was written down. But he's not drawing from written work, except maybe in some of the illustrations. It was actually in the Sleight of Hand Tricks book. There's a book published by someone in Toulouse, which has very similar illustrations to the drawings in the manuscript for the Sleight of Hand Tricks. They're not exactly the same, and they have weird differences. Maybe they were working from the same source. Maybe he's actually the source of the book, not copying from the book, and there's no information on Jean Prévost, who is the author of this Pleasant Diversions that was published in the 1590s, I think, or 1570s, I can't remember which now. But so most of those kinds of attempts to find some record in the written literature that would give us a hint of the purpose, the identity of the author practitioner, have come up with nothing. I mean, we have students, graduate students in Toulouse doing research for us there, and they have found some very interesting possible connections between some of the names in the manuscript. The Poncet family was a family of founders in the Royal Arsenal there, and also with a goldsmith who was producing false emeralds. So they've, interesting leads, but nothing definitive.
Hi, Dr. Smith. Thank you so much for the fabulous presentation. I actually am curious about the genesis of this incredible collaboration, because it's clear that you have a number of international individuals and institutions participating. When did it start? How did it develop? What are the difficulties that you encountered? I know it's a lot of questions, and you might not be able to give us the full detailed history of it, but I'm really curious at how it came about.
Well, I guess that actually with Amy Myers and I, who is the head of the British Arts Center here, she and I organized a conference in 2005 in London, in which we had, at institutions, we brought in conservators and conservation scientists and curators and scholars around objects in museums. So we had 5 different locations, and it was quite incredible. And we, for example, in one of the breakout sessions that I was engaged in, we had a we had life casting, because I was interested in life casting, and that's how I first came across this manuscript, as I think I said. But we had life casts from the Royal Collections, from the V&A, from some of the from the whatever it's called, Gilbert Collection. No, what is it called? Wallace Collection. And we talked about, this whole group talked about them, and I realized, wow, I have learned so much in such a short time by getting around, around objects, which, I mean, the people from the Institute for Conservation here, that's what they do for a living. But I, as a historian of science and a textual scholar, had not, although I was writing about objects, I had never had that kind of interchange around objects. So I thought, wow, this is really the way to go. And so since then, which was 2005, I've been trying to have classes in which I take students to look at objects, not so path-breaking by any means for all of you art historians. But I came to realize that the making component was missing. And then when I first started reading this manuscript, I realized I cannot, because it is very chaotic, the description of life casting, I can't understand this technique because I don't have experience with it. I mean, so I started collaborating in 2007 with a silversmith, a trained silversmith, and metals conservator, Tony Benches from the University of Amsterdam. And we started reconstructing the life casting recipes. And it was, it was so revelatory to me, just how that was a better way to learn these techniques than trying to understand them in reading in words, that I thought this would be great for students. And then I started thinking, how can I possibly, this manuscript became more and more interesting to me because I began to realize the range of recipes in it. And I realized, how could I make this more widely disseminated or widely known? Well, I need to publish some sort of edition of it, but oh my gosh, I could never publish an edition. I would be dead before I even finished color making. So I realized the scientific research group, postdocs, graduate students, undergraduates, and working on this as a research object. And so what it's really, it's the historian of science discovers the scientific research group. And so it's been a very effective and faster means of producing knowledge about this text, although extremely intensive and exhausting for everybody, to do these classes in which you're trying to discuss texts. I mean, we have a full reading list, which we try to discuss every week, plus we do the hands-on stuff. It's just incredible. I mean, it's a 4-hour class once a week, plus at least 2 hours a week in lab time. I mean, at least 2 hours a week, more like, 5 hours a week or more. During the end of the semester when they're all writing their annotations. And then we, the postdocs, I have 3 postdocs and we edit those annotations. And that means really prepare them for publication which is also extremely intensive work. So it's wonderful experience for as a teacher and for the students as well. It's really changed some of their dissertations, the exposure to materials. But it is very, I mean, I don't know how to do it on a less intensive scale, actually. If you're really producing knowledge, original knowledge, that's the thing. You could just have a skill building class, which would also be great. But if you're really trying to give them that research product at the end, it's intense.
Did you partner with, obviously, other departments within Columbia in order to carry out some of the experiments? Because I can imagine that the making part was new for you as well.
Oh yeah, well, we didn't so much partner with other departments, but we brought in expert makers. So in the first year we had a sculptor interested in historical techniques. Well, first I brought in Tony, my collaborator on life casting. Then we had, the second semester, we had a UK sculptor interested in historical and knowledgeable about historical techniques. In the second year, we brought in people who, conservators who were knowledgeable about pigments. And so we always have someone who is an expert in these making processes and in the historical period as well.
Thank you.
Great presentation. I just have one quick question. Going back to the burn salve, I was wondering, you mentioned for that example specifically that there was the synthesis and the implementation of that ointment had a spiritual overtone to it. Was that common in the other 39 recipes found?
No, not at all. Not at all.
So that was unique,
Yeah.
that one?
Yeah. I mean, that's what's, there is the making of rosary beads, but that's the only other trace of, religious dimension in this manuscript. So that's also a little bit strange for that particular period when there's incredible religious conflict going on in France, in Toulouse at the same, or slightly before the 1590s.
I think we're going to have to move on to the next act.
Yes.
To interrupt this wonderful conversation. Pam, you're reachable.
Yes.
Columbia.
Yeah. If you just
And
search.
there's also a great
yeah.
website of this project already underway. So
Yes, that's right. There is a very extensive website.
dive deep and be prepared to
Yeah.
get lost.
Makingandknowing.org. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much for your attention and your questions.